Welcome back. It's almost 20 after 8 o'clock. This is News and Views on Salam Media, and we will try to get hold of our previous guest on a more stable line if we are able to do that and get the story behind the ethnic killings in. In one of Sudan's cities, which has left between 10 to 15,000 dead. And this is according to a United Nations report. But we're moving along, and we're now going to be talking with Gwinyai Taruvinga, who is Wits University's Global Change Institute, and he's going to talk with us about the Congolese president having made a landslide victory in December elections, which are being highly contested by opposition candidates. So, what do we expect is going to now happen regarding this win? And we also know that the current president, who is uh, Tshisekedi, has been sworn in for a second term. But amidst lots of disputes, he was first sworn in as president in January 2019 after controversially defeating Joseph Kabila. So, what is the state of play right now, or is it truly about the people have spoken? A very good morning to you, Mr. Taruvinga. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And you, before you respond to my questions, let's ask you about being at the Institute at Wits University's Global Change. What is it all about?
So the Global Change Institute is an institute based in the Faculty of Sciences at Wits University. And essentially, we focus on a lot of work to do with climate change and its impact on society in South Africa.
Wonderful. What are you currently involved in? Because we're now talking politics, not to say that climate change doesn't fall under that ambit, but regarding the story, the Congo, the DR's Congo story, where and how are you involved or interested? Are you Congolese yourself?
No, ma'am. So I have a PhD in political studies, majoring in obviously governance issues in Africa with a special focus on natural resources. So as you would know, DRC is one of the richest countries in terms
Mm.
of natural resources on the African continent. So that's how I then fit into this particular discussion.
Wonderful. And this is the country where we have the story around the blood diamonds, that the poorest of the poor are being terribly exploited by going in and mining many other mineral resources, but particularly the story behind the blood diamonds. Would I be correct?
Yes, ma'am. So essentially, what you also need to be looking at is this idea of natural resources, but you also need to look at it within the context of colonialism. So essentially, what happened in 1884 till about 1885, there was the Berlin Conference that was led by Otto von Bismarck. And apparently, the idea of that entire conference was that King Leopold II of Belgium had apparently discovered DRC and all its natural resources. So the idea of that particular conference was to sort of deal with the DRC and see how Europe could benefit from those natural resources. Hence, you mentioned the idea of black diamonds. There's also a natural resource there called cobalt, which is what we use in our cell phones, and it comes from the DRC and it's used in our cell phones. So Apple, Samsung, all these companies have a vested interest in the DRC.
So there are two questions that follow on your response. Very sad, because when we talk about the cobalt, we do know that young children are being deprived of an education, and they then are involved in that particular industry. I'd like a response there. And when we go back to the story of the blood diamonds, again, it's the very, very strong colonial influence in the DRC, and you kind of wonder. if Western, well, I guess you don't even wonder. I think that it does indicate that Western governments are very involved in getting the right candidate elected in a presidential position, so that their interests, the colonialist interest, will be protected. I am making a very long statement with a whole host of other issues here as well, but it's all tied down into their rich mineral resources. We also know that Israel has a huge part to play here, because a lot of the unpolished diamonds have a market in Israel, and they are the leaders in the world that then obviously polish and grade the diamonds and then sell it to the rest of the world. Your thoughts?
So in terms of the first question, ma'am, when you spoke about the children, I think this has been an ongoing debate in the DRC for a very, very long time. And I think this is again the debate that we're currently seeing, that within the midst of what's happening globally with Ukraine and Russia, with what's currently happening with Palestine and Israel, it seems like the situation in the DRC has sort of gone under the radar, and a lot of these violations, especially against children, aren't being reported as much, or are not getting, the airplay on mainstream media. But this has been an ongoing situation in the DRC for a very, very, very long time. So a lot still needs to be done in terms of educating the African continent on the issues that are happening in the DRC. Because, like I said, everything is getting lost within the midst of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, as well as Palestine and Israel. And then concerning the colonial impacts and just the governance of the DRC, I'd like to take you back again to I think around about 1960, 1961, when the Belgians sort of withdrew from the DRC. And what we see from that withdrawal was that when Patrice Lumumba then became prime minister, he did not have a very good relationship with the former colony Belgium and also the United States of America as sort of the global hegemon at that particular time. So with Patrice Lumumba, he was sort of seen as leaning towards Russia. And in one of his addresses, just after he became prime minister, he essentially told the Belgians that we are your monkeys no longer, essentially saying that we are no longer your colonial subject, we will no longer be subjugated to your rule, where you are essentially subverting the will of the people of the Congo, as well as extracting our minerals and not, returning those minerals to the benefit of the country. So after that particular debacle, Lumumba was essentially now an enemy for not only Belgium, but also the United States, because again, like you said, the United States and first world countries were benefiting a lot from these natural resources in the DRC. So what then happened is, through the United Nations Security Council, the United States, together with Belgium, staged a military coup, which then removed Patrice Lumumba from his office as prime minister, and he was also murdered. So to add insult to injury, it is only a few years ago that the Belgians actually returned what remained of Patrice Lumumba, which was his tooth. And I think they returned this about 2 years ago, which again shows you just the nature of colonialism, the brutal nature of it, and just this, idea that there's always external influence when it comes to the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And very sadly, Gwinyai, the issue is it's not only the DRC, it's happened repeatedly in the global south, and we, the people of the global south, are stupid enough to fall for the tricks of the supposed Western masters. You've just indicated that there was a coup when the previous president, when he was ousted, he was killed, he was murdered, and this plays out over and over and over again. On the African continent. Just before you came on air, we were meant to be talking with someone else regarding the ethnic killings in Sudan. And undoubtedly, when you look deep into that story or any other story on the African continent, it will go right down to the rule of colonialism and their vested interest in that part of Africa. This story plays out over and over and over again. What needs to happen to break the cycle? I must tell you, I was very hopeful a couple of years ago when Joseph Kabila was elected. You know, he was young, he had fresh ideas, and I thought, well, perhaps this, you know, he's going to follow in his father's footsteps and make right what his father couldn't get right in the DRC. Was I being too optimistic then?
Well, look, I think what you are talking about as well, like I think when you spoke about the hopes you had for Joseph Kabila coming in as a young president, he represented, I think, a hope that a lot of African, countries hadn't seen in a very long time. And what you're saying is also similar to President Ramaphosa's New Dawn in South Africa, where there was
Mm.
also hope that he was going to address particular challenges, and many feel that that hasn't happened. I'll also take you further north to Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe just been taken out. When President Mnangagwa came in, he also spoke about sort of, different, changing the dynamics of governance in Zimbabwe, but that didn't come to fruition. And in terms of a solution, I don't think I have a solution for that because I think it lies mainly with the leadership. But I think one idea which I think we need to explore as the African continent is how we can better use our institutions. So when I talk about our institutions, I'm talking about our African Union. We're talking about our SADC in Southern Africa. We're talking about ECOWAS further up on the continent. And I think, for example, the AU, at least in theory, has this really important governance protocols that they adhere to. They have these policies that they've implemented that concern controversial elections, as we're discussing in the DRC. They have mechanisms in which they address situations where there was a military coup. So, for example, if you look at what happened in Mali, what happened in Burkina Faso, the AU was actually at the forefront of sort of castigating that to say this is not how we should, address our issues on the African continent. So I think the idea that we need to be pursuing on the African continent is how can we better use our institutions such as the AU? How can we better use our regional bodies such as SADC? I think that is where we can then proffer the solutions that we need so that our leaders at least know that if they're part of a bigger picture, which is a big institution like the AU, they might maybe to a certain extent adhere to the principles that would ideally want them to adhere to.
So I'm also thinking, Gwinyai, that we talk about the AU, but we do know that with the recent genocide playing out in Palestine, we've been hearing lots of comments like the United Nations are a toothless organization. I'm wondering then about the AU. Would we eventually come to a point where we'll be feeling the same about them? Are our leaders honest and strong enough to put down their foot and say, enough is enough? We refuse to act on the behest of the Western world, the United Nations, the United States, the European countries, and even the UK, because what the global North is doing is literally holding the global South to hostage. They continue behaving, and we accept it. We are to blame. We accept their behavior. They continue behaving as the masters, cracking the whip, and we continue being the slaves to their, all of their fancies regarding getting their dirty paws onto our precious minerals and dividing and ruling us, creating turmoil in the global South.
Look, I think you raised a very important point, and to answer you, I will sort of look at, for example, the role South Africa played just recently, taking Israel to the ICC. That was really a monumental, I think, moment, not only for South Africa as a country, but for the African continent. To say that this is a country in an Africa on the African continent, but it is standing up to what we would call bullies, essentially the sort of bully does what is sort of happening in Palestine and Israel at the moment. And I always think to say that I've always thought that South Africa has a leading role to play in terms of, having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, and also just its role in terms of democracy on the African continent and the role that it plays in peacekeeping in certain African countries. So if we can have a country like South Africa leading the role on an international arena with a case such as what's happening in Palestine and Israel, that I think again is a blueprint that we can learn from as the entire African continent as a whole. To say that if South Africa, for example, leads the way in that particular manner, maybe, and then this is a huge maybe, other African countries can also try to get their house in order in terms of democracy, get their house in order in terms of transparent institutions that serve the will of the people. Because at the end of the day, when we look at cases like South Sudan that you've mentioned, when we look at a country like the DRC that we're discussing, the idea goes back to institutions that are failing to serve the people. To say you have a country rich in natural resources, but those natural resources are not coming back to the country, they're going elsewhere. It speaks to institutions that are porous. It speaks to institutions that to a certain extent have been captured by first world countries, that have been captured by the Western world, as you've spoken about. So I think the idea, it goes back to how we need to have independent, strong institutions that serve the will of the people.
Okay, let's look at this case that South Africa has taken to the ICJ. It is very encouraging to note that a few other countries have come on board supporting South Africa's stance in this situation. The global north could argue that South Africa has, real issues of its own regarding, crumbling SOEs, non-deliverance, corrupt politicians, etc., etc. How do you weigh up, on the one hand, South Africa having taken such a noble stance in taking Israel to the ICJ and having set a precedent, having set an amazing example where we're now hearing Indonesia is also going to be filing a case at the ICJ against Israel and a few other countries from the global south. That's most encouraging as well. But it could also then be argued, but we don't have our own houses in order. We have large claims, and I know that I'm going beyond the scope of the DRC, but I guess what I am putting out this morning with you, Gwinyai, is we see similar issues playing out in all of Africa's countries. You have huge unemployment, you have child labor issues with the DRC and other parts of Africa. We have corrupt politicians, and the gap between the rich and poor is just widening and widening and widening. And this is directly due to the fact that the global north is interfering in our politics by divide and rule to protect their own greedy interests in Africa.
Yes, indeed, I do agree. And when it comes to the ICJ court case and trying to sort of weigh it with what's happening, domestically for South Africa as well, you'll find that, of course, I think there are a lot of difficulties from the domestic aspect of South Africa's politics, and the ANC actually faces a really difficult challenge with the upcoming elections because of all those issues that you mentioned. You say the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen. Let's not even forget about load shedding, the issues with water as well. And I think like any country, you have your foreign policy as well as your domestic policy as well. And I think with the ICJ court case, what we're seeing is just, I think, South Africa pursuing its foreign policy, and I think Naledi Pandya has led the clarion call in this regard concerning Palestine as well as other issues on the African continent that she's also tried to touch on. But just also then take it back to the domestic element that you've spoken about. This, I think, unfortunately, is also part of a wider global issue that we've been seeing since the pandemic. Of course, I think before that, there were also challenges, but I think the pandemic sort of exacerbated some of the challenges that we're seeing in a lot of countries. So even if you look at one of them, let's say just one of the most progressive countries in the world, let's say the United States of America, for example, they're also having their own domestic issues, and it's likely that President or former President Trump will be running again for the election, and it seems like he has a very good chance of winning again. And that is also going to have huge ramifications for their foreign policy. So the point I'm trying to make here as well is to say that in any country, there's a domestic policy and there's a foreign policy. And sometimes you find that the foreign policy might be completely, detached from what's happening domestically. And this is what we're seeing in South Africa. But this, again, does not, negate the fact that South Africa as well, in terms of the ANC especially, needs to do a lot more in terms of addressing the internal issues such as load shedding, such as unemployment, and also such as water shortage. All these things are very important, and it goes back again to this idea of governance and institutions, especially within our African countries.
And whatever, I guess South Africa mirrors what has happened in the rest of Africa and will continue
Yes,
mirroring that situation regarding the greedy global north. That being
yes.
said, let's go back to the DRC's issue, their elections. We do know that once again, Tshisekedi has been sworn in as president. He's making a lot of promises. What now happens as far as the opposition party is concerned? Is it just business as usual? And where on earth is Joseph Kabila? Is he still active in politics in the DRC?
So when the last time I'd heard about concerning Joseph Kabila in this particular election was from the previous election that he had lost, and from my understanding, he was trying to run for a third term, which is against the constitution of the DRC. So that is how then President Tshisekedi then became president of the DRC. I think 5 years ago for his first term. So what's important concerning this election in the DRC is that in the first term, one of President Tshisekedi's promises was that he was going to sort of address these issues we're discussing, which is addressing the institutions in the DRC and as well as ensuring that the country would benefit from its natural resources. But that hasn't happened. So when he then campaigned for the second term, he sort of made promises to say that he had made progress in terms of addressing issues to do with education, and he needed a second term in terms of complementing that. And that's essentially how he then campaigned. With the particular election, I think he won, I think the election was in December, and he won over 70% of the vote. But a lot of the opposition leaders in the country sort of cried foul concerning how the election was conducted in some regions in the country, because the DRC is a very large country. You find that some people are still voting 5 days after the election. And this was sort of, an indictment of the institutions in the DRC. And it also, again, brought to question to say that where exactly was this element of democracy within the election? Because I think the idea there is that the institutions, again, did not serve the will of the people, but rather serve the will of the incumbent. And in this case, it was President Tshisekedi.
So undoubtedly, there were foreign forces at play here as well,
Mm,
and of course, there's no chance at all of calling the elections results null and void. That kind of is not heard of, is it? You can't go for a recount, or you can't have a repetition of what perhaps has happened in the United States, because we don't have the sophisticated infrastructure as Western nations. So I guess it's just a wait and see over the next 5 years if he's going to deliver or not, or is he just there to continue lining his pockets and appeasing his Western masters? But Gwinyai, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I do hope going forward we're going to have many more conversations. Thank you indeed for your input.
Thank you, ma'am. Enjoy the rest of your day. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. God bless. Thank you indeed. It is
Thank you, ma'am.
exactly 8:44 news and views on Salam Media. In a minute or two, we are going to speak with Professor Lesiba Tefo. He is a political analyst, and we're going to be looking at the elections 2024, the MK party.